Welcome to week 2. In this week, we're going to look at the building blocks of convolutional neural networks, or CNNs. We are then going to go on to explore the broad range of options available for loss functions and optimizers. In this first session, we will look at the component parts of CNNs before stepping through the process of forward and back propagation, and finally looking in detail at CNN network classes in PyTorch. By the end of this session, it is hoped that you understand what motivates the design of these networks and correspondingly what it is about them that makes them so powerful. You should understand how each of the components of CNN architectures are implemented, specifically the computation of the convolutional operation, pooling which supports hierarchical multi-scale learning of features, batch normalization for improving training efficiency and generalization, and dropout for regularization. We will also discuss how this design necessitates slight differences in forward and back propagation relative to fully connected networks. In the tutorial, we will work through implementation of our own CNN for MNIST classification using PyTorch. In this first video lecture, we will start by looking in more detail at the convolutional operation as applied to images. First, let's address the computational motivations. In the last lecture, we saw that we could train an MLP or fully connected network for MNIST classification. But MNIST images are 2D with shape 28 by 28. In other words, they're tiny. By contrast, today's standard JPEG might have dimensions 640 by 480 by 3 color channels, whereas an MRI of a brain can easily have dimensions of 300 by 300 by 200 voxels. In these cases, if all voxels were connected, this would require the learning of enormous weights matrices, with, for example, 18 million parameters, where having way more features than examples is a big problem for machine learning as it leads to overfitting and poor generalization. While natural image datasets are big, they're not that big, and medical image datasets are certainly much smaller than that. Also, it should be emphasized that all this is unnecessary anyway. A fully connected network, like a linear regression, treats each feature independently. However, for images, information in adjacent pixels or voxels is correlated. More than that, we know that images can be modelled as a hierarchy of increasingly complex textures. For example, consider Fourier transform encodings of magnetic resonance images. These encode images as hierarchical patterns of increasing spatial frequency. Such properties equally apply to natural images. Further, we know that this is a sensible way to model or reconstruct images because this is exactly how the mammalian brain does it, where signals received by the eyes travel from the retina to the back of the brain, where they reach the region known as V1. This is the first visual region, which processes information from the visual field topographically. In other words, adjacent points of the visual field are represented at adjacent points in that region. And the cells of V1 are known to act as edge detectors, so they're able to detect the high spatial frequency features of an image. More complex patterns are then learnt by passing the information processed by V1 to a series of other brain regions, namely V2 and V4, which learn to detect a hierarchy of more complex image textures. The visual streams then split to perform different tasks. For example, we have object recognition and motion tracking. For object recognition, regions higher in the processing stream continue to learn increasingly complex representations until the signals reach the inferior temporal cortex, or IT regions shown here, where individual cells are known to activate for individual objects such as faces. CNNs are therefore designed to mimic this process. Representations are learnt over many convolutional layers, where early layers can be seen to act as edge detectors and higher layers detect more complex textures or whole objects. This allows images to be compared without any requirement for spatial normalization or image registration, which means we don't need to make any assumptions that corresponding image pixels at the same relative locations in each image represent the same content. This point is very important. Away from the use of CNNs or the traditional hand-engineered feature detector methods which preceded them, conventional machine learning treats examples as feature vectors. directly comparing features at the same location along that vector. While we might get away with it for MNIST, where digits are centered and don't vary hugely, this is a major constraint if your images vary in ways which preclude the learning of such one-to-one mappings. This is true of complex scenes, and as you will learn, is also true for many biological structures. The big advantage that CNNs have over hand-engineered feature detectors is that they learn bespoke features suited to a specific problem at hand. For example, here is a visualization of what features are learnt when training a CNN on a natural image dataset. The patches labelled as layer 1, 2, and 5 reflect the filter kernels or features learnt, and the blocks of patches next to them give examples of the images or regions of images which activate strongly for each feature. So specifically, in this first layer, this whole block of 9 patches corresponds to patches from images which activate for this specific image filter here, where these next 9 patches correspond to the next image filter. By contrast, in the next layers, there's one-to-one correspondence between the filter and the image patch. Hopefully, in some examples, such as this one, you should be able to see clearly how the feature reflects the image. Then, by the time the network gets to this 5th layer, the features are firing for whole objects or large parts of objects, such as animal or human faces or wheels, for example. And to an extent like the mammalian visual system, CNNs can be trained to perform many different visual tasks, for example, object classification, labelling images by their semantic content, here car, alternatively object localization, detecting where in the image the car is, or semantic segmentation, labelling all pixels in an image which correspond to that object. Having said that, unlike the biological visual system, which generalizes across many tasks at one time, currently we will require very different designs of CNNs to perform different tasks. Attempts to reconcile this, however, continue to take inspiration from the mammalian brain. So now let's move on to look at the convolutional operation itself. First, in the context of hand-engineered features, specifically here, a Sobel edge detector, which looks like this. So there are actually 2 filters involved here, one to detect horizontal edges and one to detect vertical edges. The idea is to effectively estimate a finite difference approximation of the image gradient by convolving the image with these filters. So in other words, we want to return a new image which has high intensity edges where image intensity changes sharply. That is, where the gradient is large. To demo how this works, we're going to go through the process of computing this operation just for a very small part of a 2D slice through an MRI image of the human brain. Specifically, this patch here, which clearly cuts across an edge between a very bright and a very dark structure. The actual values of this 8x8 image patch can be seen blown up in this grid here. We will now convolve this patch with this vertical Sobel filter, noting that technically what we're calculating here is a cross correlation and not a convolution, as true convolutions flip the filter before moving it over the image. Where CNNs also ignore this technicality since, as they are learning the filter from the data from scratch, it's irrelevant whether they learn the true convolution or the flipped version. So this is a perfectly valid assumption. Stepping through the process, the operation itself involves element-wise multiplication and sum. So here we have 1 times 55 plus 0 times 60 minus 1 times 65 for the top row. Then 2 times 67 plus 0 times 65 minus 2 times 63 for the second row, and 1 times 73 plus 0 times 64 minus 1 times 62 for the third row. This is all added together and returns 9, which is then allocated to this middle pixel, which becomes the outer top left pixel for the output of the full convolutional operation. Note, therefore, that the image grid that results from the operation has size 2 rows and 2 columns less than the original, corresponding to the number of full times this kernel can be fit into the space. Then, once the product has been calculated at this first location, the filter is shifted along by 1 in this case, and the operation is performed again, returning minus 13 this time. This carries on for each location in the top row, fitting filter kernels at every location until it reaches the far right hand side. Then it switches down to the next row and slides along again, row by row, until it reaches the bottom right corner. The final result of the convolutional operation will therefore be to return a new image where only vertical edges in the image remain. This is because, as an edge detector, the amplitude of the element-wise product and sum operation will be largest at locations where there is the strongest change of intensity from left to right. Whereas if it's approximately constant, then the contributions from the left-hand side and the right-hand side fully cancel out. Note, a couple of important steps are glossed over, so specifically the full Sobel operation convolves both vertical and horizontal filters and then combines them to return sharp edges in all directions for the whole image. And secondly, the output of the filter should be divided by 4 to return the correct finite difference calculation of the gradient. So that's how convolutions are computed, but how do we stop the operation from shrinking our image grid? Well, we use padding. We can add a layer of zeros to the outside of the image to allow our kernels to be centered at the outermost pixels of the image. For example, by fitting these zeros around the outer edge of our image, we can see now that the top left-hand side kernel will be centered on the original top left-hand side corner of the image. For 3x3 kernels, we require 1 layer of padding, but larger kernels will clearly require more. Incidentally, now may be a good time to emphasize that it is conventional to apply convolutional kernels with odd numbers of rows and columns, as this gives them a center. Also noting that in deep learning terminology, a convolution without padding is known as a valid convolution, and a convolution which returns an output with the same size as the image using padding is known as a same convolution. So the next thing we need to consider are strides. So in deep learning, convolutions can be implemented by skipping some elements out. For example, let's say we have the following image of size 7x7 and we want to apply a convolution with stride 2. The first element of the operation remains as before. We fit a kernel to the first available position on the top left-hand side of the image and perform element-wise multiplication and sum. However, then we skip over the next available position as shown by the blue dotted line and instead move 2 pixels along to fit our kernel at the position shown by the red box. This returns minus 27 as before, but this time is the next element in our output matrix. Then, if we skip 2 along again, we meet the outer right corner of the image and have to stop. In this way, translating the filter kernel across the image, skipping 2 each time, means that we reduce the dimensions in the following way, with the output dimensions of the image scaling as h, the input dimension, plus 2 times p, where p is padding, minus f, the filter dimension, all divided through by s, the stride. This is then rounded down, which is shown by these funny brackety symbols, and 1 is added to that result. Note accordingly that not all input dimensions support strides of size greater than 1 by default, since in principle the kernels need to fit into the image a whole number of times given the stride. Having said that, if you pass incompatible image and stride dimensions to modern deep learning frameworks such as PyTorch, they are just going to automatically pad the image to make it fit. So finally, returning to the topic of hand-engineered features, it's important to highlight that beyond edge detector methods such as Sobel filters, Many more sophisticated techniques have been developed, such as SIFT, SURF, LBP, and Hog features. These learn large banks of filters designed to detect more complex image features or textures, such as specific key points as shown here for the SIFT transform, where these are designed to be as far as possible transformation invariant, in other words, robust to rotations, translations, and scales. Images are then compared not at each location, but by comparing all combinations of detected features in each image to identify common key points. CNNs work similarly, but go one step further to design bespoke filter kernels which, as a result, are more finely tuned to different image recognition tasks. They do this by optimizing the network weights, where these weights matrices specifically correspond to the learned filter kernels. So unlike fully connected networks, we are no longer learning large weight matrices that correspond to the full dimensions of the images. Rather, our weights are 3x3 or 5x5 or 7x7 convolutional kernels of some given depth. And CNNs train not just one set of filters, but hierarchies of them, such that at each layer of a convolutional neural network, the weights matrices or filters are convolved with the image to generate an activation map for that layer. Then that activation map becomes the input to the next layer. So this allows the network to learn hierarchically more complex textures as they are combining responses from earlier layers. For example, you might envisage how merging combinations of edge activations at different orientations might encode texture. At the same time, after every few layers, data is downsampled through pooling or striding. This increases the receptive field size of filters at each level, shown here by boxes of different sizes. For example, yellow for the first layer, orange for the next block of layers, pink for the penultimate block of layers perhaps, and green for the final layers. This allows the networks to learn to recognize image features at increasing scale until eventually at the end the network is starting to recognize parts of objects such as wheels before finally detecting whole objects, in other words the car. So combining multi-scale learning with the fact that 2 or 3D Euclidean convolutions are translation equivariant by design means that standard CNNs for image processing are translation invariant. So in other words, if an image is translated and then convolved, the output would be the same as if the image was convolved and then translated. This is equivariance. CNNs are invariant to translations, meaning an object anywhere in a scene will still be recognized as the same thing, and this occurs because of the downsampling. Unfortunately, however, this property is reserved for translation and scales and does not apply to other types of translation like rotations and nonlinear deformations. So that's why we use augmentations, and we'll come back to this next week. Regardless, this is a very important and powerful property of Euclidean CNNs, which, as you will see in the final lecture of the course, does not come so easily for other domains such as graphs and surfaces. So in summary, the design of convolutional neural networks originated as a simplified model of mammalian vision, motivated by the challenges involved in scaling deep learning to image processing, as well as the understanding that image features are not independent and rather that images may be viewed as a hierarchy of increasingly complex textures or spatial frequencies at multiple scales. The convolutional operation involves translating a small filter kernel, say 3x3 pixels, over an image, where at each location the output of the convolution for the center pixel is estimated through performing an element-wise multiplication and sum between the filter elements and the image values that they overlap with. By default, this results in an output image which is smaller than the original image. However, this can be fixed through padding with zeros, where the exact amount of padding depends on the size of the convolutional kernel. Convolutions which are padded to keep input and output grids the same shape are called same convolutions, and those which aren't are called valid convolutions. Note, in deep learning, convolutional operations are not constrained to fit filters at all image locations, rather that locations might be skipped through striding. Combinations of striding S and padding P operations will rescale the output dimensions relative to the input dimensions according to this formula. Finally, the overarching goal of CNNs is to learn bespoke image filters through optimizing network weights, where for CNNs, the weights are the convolutional filters. They do this hierarchically over many layers, where the outputs of one convolution are passed through activation functions to subsequently then become the inputs to the next layer. This allows networks to learn filters sensitive to increasingly complex textures in ways that are scale and translational invariant. So that's it for this section. Before going on to the next video, please attempt the Keats quiz.